so that is what's causing it. Weird. Yeah, that's annoying.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I think we're good.
Okay.
Okay, so unless somebody in the tech booth tells me otherwise, we'll get started. I'm Mary Bennett, and I'm on the UCV's Denominational Affairs Committee. And there'll be four segments to the forum presentation part today, and then there'll be a time for Q&A, and there'll be people on YouTube putting in chat questions or comments, etc. So the sequence is I'm going to talk a bit about the process that the Canadian Unitarian Council used between 2002 to 2008, which resulted in affirming the then 7 principles and 6 sources. And then Keith Wilkinson, who can't be here today, has sent some slides of an update about what CUC has done since that time. And then Rev Laura will talk about the Article 2 draft to the UUA, and then I'll speak for a bit about some of the dissenting voices. So, so I worked for the CUC for 8 years. For probably most of that time, Reverend Mark Morrison Reed was on the board, and for at least 2 years, he was the president. So I love to invoke his voice whenever I'm doing something about the CUC. And if you don't know Mark, he's very large and has a very deep voice, so I won't attempt that. The task of the religious community. The central task of the religious community is to unveil the bonds that bind each to all. There is a connectedness, a relationship discovered amid the particulars of our own lives and the lives of others. Once felt, it inspires us to act for justice. It is the church that assures us that we are not struggling for justice on our own, but as members of a larger community. The religious community is essential. For alone, our vision is too narrow to see all that must be seen, and our strength too limited to do all that must be done. Together, our vision widens and our strength is renewed. So I'm looking at my slides here, and they're going to appear up there. There they are. Okay. So I'll go to the next one. So at the May 2002 annual general meeting of the CUC, there was a final vote to separate officially CUC from the UUA, the Unitarian Universalist Association. And at that meeting, we adopted the 7 principles of the time, 6 sources, and what this task force report calls the envelope text, i.e. the stuff before and after in between that introduces the parts. So in the end, the changes were, we put a U in neighbor, and we spelled earth-centered, the UK British way, and of course changed UUA to CUC. And at the time, though, one thing that I'm quite pleased managed to happen in a short time frame is that there were several French versions of the principles and sources circulating, and we actually adopted an official French language version. And there was some interest. It was exciting times. There was some interest in creating and voting on what we were going to call a statement for all ages, i.e. what's often called a kids version. But that time didn't allow that. So of course, as soon as there was a move afoot to adopt those, there was a rallying cry from some people saying, wait a minute, we have these principles and sources because congregations are also members of the UUA, but since we're not going to be members of the UUA, maybe we need a fresh start Canadian version. So with responding to that voice, the CUC board set up a Statement of Principles task force to choose a process for reviewing the principles to allow consultation in all Canadian congregations. And I've bolded that because that's where most of the workshops and consultation happened, was at the congregational level. Okay, Juliet, can we have the slide that says mandate on it? Let me know when it shows. Are we at that one? We're at that one? Yeah. Okay. Juliet, can we move forward? Are we on that one? I can talk to this. Okay, so a task force was set up, and people were chosen with a view to regional representation and age diversity, etc. And when the group got together, they decided, similar to what I think the UUA did, that let's start first of all from scratch. Let's not just tweak the principles and sources, but to start from scratch. So they created a workshop with these 6 questions and encouraged congregations to do these workshops in the congregation and to send the results back to the Statement of Principles Task Force. Next one. And then after that, what they did, somebody with statistical, technical skills, not me, did a very extensive matrix mapping. So they took all the principles and all the feedback from the congregations and said, where is there alignment and where are there some gaps? And those details are in the 28-page report that Kirsten sent out with the last email newsletter. Moving forward. And that, we'll go on that one. So, so at the May 2005 annual meeting, the analysis of that work and a summary was presented. And the two main points from the report was this was a highly emotional process, and people are very attached to the current statement. And therefore, the task force recommended and the board accepted, let's pay even closer. I added the word even because I think we were doing a good job of communications. So let's pay even closer attention. Let's slow the whole process down. And let's engage ministers more fully in the process. So up till then, ministers were involved because they were involved in their congregations, but they hadn't directly been consulted with as a group. Workshop number 3. Okay. I might have got these in the wrong order because I was fiddling around with them. So the 3rd workshop was going back to the current statement, since that's what the task force was hearing loud and clear, is we like it the way it is. We wouldn't mind some tweaks, but we like it the way it is. So the task force developed a 3rd congregational workshop. And so there was no clear call to rewrite the statement at that time. Strong affirmation of the principles as they stood, less strong support, but fairly strong support for the 6 sources. And I left the CUC in the fall of 2008, so this report was delivered in May. And going through it with a fine-tooth comb, really, I had actually forgotten this part of there was a significant number that suggested a stronger focus on environmental stewardship. And in terms of the sources, you don't have to read all the details here, but the compilation was asking people to look at the 6 sources and say, I like it as it is, I'd omit this entirely, or I would like this reworded. And you can see number 4, Jewish and Christian teachings, was the most controversial one. 67% of congregations and 39% of individuals wanted that reworded, and quite a few people just wanted it omitted. So after that, the task force recommended that there be further exploration of and education about the sources, and the process should emphasize a both-and approach. So not competing ideas, but let's kind of come to something that people can have some consensus about. And the other area with regard to the sources that was controversial was the actual introductory language and the language afterwards. So one of the dilemmas the task force realized was that people use the sources both for individual faith development. These are the 6 sources I, Mary, draw on for my religious beliefs and actions. But it's also a statement of associational identity. This is what the Canadian Unitarian Council draws on. So, and questions about what are these anyways? Are they a historical account of our sources, or are they contemporary sources of inspiration? Not that it necessarily needs to be one or the other, but it was unclear to people. So there was again another recommendation to pursue a consultative process to determine to the extent to which an increased emphasis on environmental stewardship in the principles would be welcomed by people. And the other thing that was a theme through all 3 of the workshops was people saying, we want more emphasis on walking the talk. We want to focus on actions more than words. It's not sufficient to speak of affirming and promoting the principles without a commitment to act. And so the task force recommended to the board that a call to action be developed. So the next steps at the 2002 meeting, in advance of that, we kind of one day thought, hey, these principles aren't really ours. We use them because we're also members of the UUA, so the UUA officially gave us permission to adopt them. And of course, at the same time, there was discussion of what would happen if the UUA changed these. Are they automatically changed for Canadians? And the answer, of course, is no. So in terms of the recommendations from that task force, I'll share with you some of these slides that Keith sent, which kind of maybe address them to some degree. And another, I like questions, are they still appropriate to pursue? I think maybe. So now we need Keith's slides, a brief history of CUC's guiding documents. Somebody can tell me when that's up there? It's up there. Great, thank you. Okay, so on to the second slide, Juliet. So Keith didn't know whether I'd have 15 or 30 slides. I had 15. And he wanted me to list there the task force members. And some of these names might be familiar to you. Karen Fraser Gitlitz, for instance, was a member here and has been the minister in Saskatoon for 11 years. And John Hopewell was a longtime board member and president of the CUC, and he's in Victoria. Samantha was our youth representative. Wendy McNiven is now retired, but again was a member here in Vancouver during the time that she studied for the ministry. And as I mentioned, Mark Morrison-Reed and myself, ex officio. The next one is the bylaw revisions of around 2012. So I think this is quite a significant thing in terms of democracy. The revisions require CUC to report annually on their strategic priorities. So since 2012, every year that is part of what's shared with all the Unitarians in Canada. The revisions imply staff and board accountability for actions to be taken and goals to be accomplished. The revision addresses members' expressed interest in CUC being more action-oriented. So there's that walking the walk again. So the bylaw states that the strategic priorities for the current and the next succeeding year, next slide, be sent out. And it also, the CUC Vision Task Force report, 8 pages, which Keith can give you if you need, or somebody can find, describes the CUC Vision Task Force over a 3-year period. And it recommended a vision statement and 5 aspirations, which were adopted in the 2016 AGM. The Vision Task Force was Reverend Fiona Heath, Glenda Butt, Reverend Carly Gaylor, Vida Ing, and Keith Wilkinson, who was probably president of CUC at that point. These 5 aspirations, hold up your hand if you've ever seen these before. Oh, a few people. So we aspire to be deeply connected, radically inclusive, actively engaged, theologically alive, and spiritually grounded. And he's made some comments about the impact of UUA Article 2. Our congregation is not a member of the UUA, although 16 of 46 congregations were as of 2023. But UUA decisions affect us, obviously. Following a 3-year review, the UUA has developed a new way of presenting the values that hold them together. Following slide shows the structure. And go on to the one with love in the center. And that goes over to Rev Laura. Are you going to speak from the pulpit?
Yeah, I'll come up there. Before I get started, wow, look at all the people here. Oh, that's awesome. It's so good to see so many faces. I have printed out not enough copies of them, so some people have them. If anybody would like one of these to follow along, can I ask someone to hand them out? And this also is so this is the piece that Kirsten was going to do. Did we miss Kirsten today? I know you're online, Kirsten, and she can answer any questions that come up that I can't handle or that Mary can't pick up. And Mary, are you monitoring the chat as well? Are you? No? Okay. So then that'll have to come from Juliet, I guess, or I'm not sure who's monitoring. Derek, I think, is. Well, we'll see. It's an interesting day, lots of moving parts. So, Article 2 of the UUA bylaws. I gave kind of an introductory thing, but it actually was a sermon and not a report, although it might have felt like a report this morning. We have some wonderful history about the CUC context. Basically, the history that I want to share about what's been happening at the UUA, I heard about this when it first started, when it was still a brainchild, because it was brought up over and over at GAs as they're looking at changes that they wanted to make back for decades, and all the little ways that they had been tweaking the principles going along. And then finally they just said, especially with the 8th principle coming around and people having so many divided opinions about how it should be phrased, whether it belongs there, is it an action statement, is it a covenant statement, and the idea about, well, to affirm and promote, like you just heard from Mary, is how does that relate to actually walking the talk, affirm and promote? People are saying, somewhere in my report it says, we need more verbs. And so the commission was asked to come up with some more verbs, basically, and that's why they decided to add covenantal statements to all the values. But we're just quickly going to buzz through some of this history. Right, so that's the original 1961, and this is really interesting to me because it says things like, implement our vision of one world by striving for a world community founded on ideals of brotherhood, justice, and peace. Now that just rankles all of my anti-colonialism hairs on the back of my neck, and the language about brotherhood. I mean, of course this is outdated, and it was written by people of that time with the understanding of that time. So we can just fast forward. We know that had to change, and it did change. It didn't change easily. It changed with the kind of process that Mary described, of lots of conversation, lots of editing. And this from 1985-86, this is what are still the current. I think some of the wording was changed to be a little more gender neutral, but other than that, this is exactly what are still the 7 principles of the UUA. Okay, and in 1985, there were also some other changes that were made. And so this compares the 1961. So they did save, and a lot of the slides I have were created by another congregation that show like this, a color-coded comparison of what is current and what was adopted or put into the proposal. So to affirm, defend, and promote the supreme worth of every human personality, the dignity of man, so that became the inherent worth and dignity of every person. Right? And so it really just streamlined. It brought over a whole lot of what existed and made it make a lot more sense in the current context. Okay, next slide. We don't need to go through all of this. So this was a really important thing that happened in '85. They added the sixth source, and this was because of that push. People wanted more focus on the earth, on environmentalism, and on our earth-based spirituality and the humanism and paganism that was becoming more prevalent in congregations as we let the trappings of Christianity slip away. And there were, through the years, some things that came up that were proposed and rejected as they go around and round. I can make these slides available. I don't think we need to read through them all, but I can go a little slower if you want to. So this was interesting to me. In 2017, they came to the delegates something that passed and something that didn't pass. And there was a lot of conversation about this, and some of my friends were really upset that they didn't get the first change through. And this was the Ministry from Earth folks wanted all living creatures to be recognized, to have the same inherent worth and dignity and rights to exist as people. And that one didn't make it this time. But you know how we are. Things keep coming around. And of course, as we know, the eighth principle it's been in conversation for 10 years in the States. Grassroots initiative has come up for conversation. It didn't quite pass at the UUA. Here in Canada, it did, but the words were changed. This doesn't look like our eighth principle. We have different words. And that's appropriate. It's a different focus. So, that's the history. And where are we? Okay, so the process. The process is outlined actually pretty well in your report here. So anybody who wants a copy, you can read through this. There's a whole section that is called process. But essentially, they decided in 2020, following the report on the Commission on Appraisal reports and all the surveys that they were getting, they decided rather than continuing to try to tweak the principles, that it was time just to start a commission and do a full study. And that is a really involved process. So an Article 2 study commission was created. They were given a charge. The board gave them a charge that is also written in the report that you can read. It's quite eloquent, actually very involved. And they lifted up in that charge, the board's charge to the commission, all the feedback that they were getting from the study groups, from the surveys, from the delegates to the GAs. They put all this together from the Commission on Appraisal and said, here, this is what we want you to consider, go forth and make it happen with forums and workshops and discussion groups. Oh, there's some statistics in here about how many people they actually reached, like thousands of people, but those numbers were published in November, and since then it's probably doubled. Where is that? Oh yeah. So over the course of its work, the Commission engaged in 45 feedback sessions with 4,611 total participants. Their videos reached 7,765 viewers, and 29 surveys generated a total of 10,925 responses. Now that was prior to the initial draft that they put forward in November, that then got a whole bunch more feedback and changes were made to the proposal before it was given to the board of the UUA in January. And now it sits with the board, and they're going through more forum discussions, more feedback sessions for amendments. We, even though we're not members of the UUA, and this is not a UUA member congregation, we are welcome to participate in those forums and to provide feedback. They're going to be entertaining these amendments all the way up to and through the General Assembly. And if anybody's been to a UUA General Assembly, you know what this looks like. They've got pro and con mics, and people are lined up all the way to the coffee shop out in the hall to have their say, to make their comments. There are going to be small mini assembly rooms to have conversations and come back with amendments. The board themselves might suggest amendments. They're going to doctor and tweak this thing until they finally get to that very last cliffhanger session of the business meeting at the General Assembly. And then they're looking for a simple majority of the delegates present to say, okay, what we're presenting here with all of its amendments and all this feedback is enough for us to move it forward to next year, to have another vote. And then during that year, people can still talk about it, still propose amendments and changes, get used to the idea, see what we can do with it, see does this really fit, do we want to create new educational materials, do we want to do something else with this and not change the principles. We can keep so many things we can do, but at this vote at General Assembly this year, they're going to say whether it's even worth further discussion. And that takes a simple majority. And then next year, in June 24, it's going to take a 2/3 majority to say, okay, this is going into our bylaws. But even if that happens, in the final statement, and we'll get to this at the end, but I just want to lift this up right now. The final statement of freedom of belief says congregational freedom and the individual's right of conscience are central to Unitarian Universalist heritage. Congregations may establish statements of purpose, covenants, and bonds of union so long as they do not require that members adhere to a particular creed. So what this means is that the member congregations of the UUA can still choose whether or not they want to adopt these words themselves, or any words at all. But it will go into the bylaws if they're passed, into the UUA bylaws. All right, so where am I in these? Let's go to the pretty graphic slide. There we are. So this looks a little different than the one that was shown a little earlier. And since the one in November, they changed this as well. They changed the visual of it. I've seen a few really funky ideas about how to make this a pretty graphic. This is one of them. The word transformation in the draft that came out in November said evolution. And they got some feedback on that they accepted, and it's okay, so this round it's going to be transformation. And that one fit better for me. There are lots of things in this from my first read through, especially in November, that I went, really? And that feedback is all being incorporated as we go. And so there are a number of things that me and some of my colleagues thought were just completely missing, and I know that some of you have lifted up some things as well, and we'll get to that feedback later, but much of the feedback has been incorporated as it goes, and it still is being incorporated. And so what we're looking at today is not going to be what shows up at the General Assembly, but it's worth talking about. The slides that I have show the statements, and then the next slide will show the comparison of the current and the proposal. So next slide, please. Equity. So this is where we put in the inherent worth and dignity, but with a covenant statement to use, like how do we live into that, the covenant statement, which we read earlier. So move on. So the values statement of equity corresponds to the first principle and is written in there. So this is a new one. Generosity didn't correspond very well to any of these principles in the same way. It's lived out in different ways, but this is a value that the commission felt and from the feedback that they received really belonged. And the piece that it connects to, you can go to the next slide, is in the principle of justice, equity, compassion, and human relations. They figure compassion actually corresponds to generosity, and this principle is broken out into 3 of the value statements. Next slide. So justice actually fits into many of those value statements in different ways. Next slide. Oh, can we go back for a second? So the 5th principle, the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process within our congregations and society at large. This fits into justice, and there's a lot of stuff that falls in the justice basket, it seems. And this is one, and I've heard some people say, but that kind of waters it down. But I think there are ways to look at the covenant and how we live into it, and this is what they're trying to just lift up, is the use of inclusive democratic processes. Okay. Yeah, go ahead forward. So this one, of course, is key. We know that, moving forward. And this, what's interesting here is the covenant statement. So how do we do this? We can respect it, but is respect enough? They wanted to have an action. They wanted some verbs in here. How do we walk this talk? And so this is why they added what it means to respect it. Honoring, it's sacred. It creates nurturing relationships. There's humility and reverence. And working to repair harm is the statement that they wanted to put in there to connect to the value. Okay, and transformation. Openness to change is fundamental. Spiritual growth. So this is, acceptance of one another and encouragement to spiritual growth in our congregations. That connects to the 2 values of pluralism and transformation. Okay. So this got tweaked a lot since November as well. And it's interesting to note, what was missing in November was that 4th principle piece, the free and responsible search for truth and meaning. And a lot of people noticed that. I noticed that. I said, hey, where is that? So here it is. They put it in, we covenant to learn from each other in our free and responsible search for truth and meaning, embracing our differences and commonalities with love, curiosity, and respect, and pluralism. So this looks really messy, but if you spend a minute with it and you do the color coding, what this really is the breakout of the previous slides to show the connections. So I'm just going to let you sit with this for a second while I take a sip of water and figure out where I am in my notes. Okay. This again is just the corresponding, the existing and the proposal. What connects where? Oh, can you go back for a second? Just give that a second. Love all the legal bylaw language in there with the C 2.3, 2.2, it's hard to follow. But in the draft, it does outline those points. So in here, it's listed that way so you can follow along. And the comparison chart, that should be in the handout as well, so you can go back and forth and have a look at that later. All right, go ahead. So this one is interesting because it really, people are worried about losing the sources because this list of sources is really key to us. But what the commission was saying was that when you have a list, it is never complete. And as we saw from the study from the CUC, people have different opinions about what actually belongs in there. And so what they did was they boiled it down to more of a generalism. Sacred and secular understandings kind of covers all the world's religions, as it should. We can't just pick a handful. Lists like that are just never complete. And so they've simplified it. And so the sources were condensed, and then the purposes picked up a bit of extra language. So the current one says the primary purpose of the association is to serve the needs of its member congregations, to organize new congregations, extend and strengthen Unitarian Universalist institutions, and implement its principles. Now, in practice, the UUA actually doesn't have that kind of power, and nor should they. They don't organize new congregations. They don't extend the institutions in that way. The congregations are self-governing and independent. The UUA says they assist the congregations in their vital ministries. Now remember, the ministry is what the congregation does together. Support and train leaders, both lay and professional. They do maintain the professional standards for ministers, for religious educators, all of those things to make sure that there is some competency of some sort. And also the training of lay leaders, which is just tremendous, the resources that they have that the CUC never will have. And so that's part of the agreement that the CUC has with the UUA, is that sharing of resources. They have the publishing house, all those things. And of course, we need to do some translating into Canadian, not just about putting U's and RE's where they belong, but there's a lot more translating culturally to do, which is on us mostly, but they're open to that input. Oh, sorry, can you go back for a second? So what they're adding here, though, is looking to heal historic injustices and to advance Unitarian Universalist values in the world. And it's going to be interesting to me to see where the feedback brings us on that, because again, through that colonialist lens, we're trying not to be a service organization or to do proselytizing around the world anymore. It's just different understanding. So maybe that wording will also get tweaked. Who knows? The purpose of the Unitarian Universalist Association is to actively engage its members, and those are the congregations, in the transformation of the world through liberating love. That's the wording that they have currently. Okay. So it didn't change a whole lot, this one in the proposal, except they did add, instead of welcoming all persons, they've actually drawn a line, saying all persons who share our values. And I have to say, from my, it's going to be interesting to see how that gets interpreted, but in my experience, and I've worked with Unitarian and Unitarian Universalist communities around the world, there have been some historical stumbling blocks in some of our communities when we say anyone's welcome. And we don't actually draw a line to say about covenantal behavior and what is actually acceptable in this community. And so I think that's what they're pointing at here, is people who share our values, and then those values need to be clearly stated with covenantal, and this is what we expect and how you live those values. I think that's what they're getting at. And then the marginalized identities as a specific focus. Okay. And current freedom of belief, the individual freedom of belief, the proposal is congregational freedom and the individual's right of conscience. So just really clarifying that the congregations are independent. Okay. This is the word cloud that we created here at UCV last month. on that really cool Mentimeter thing that you were playing with. So these are the value statements that came up for this community. I just thought we need to throw that in there as a segue. And thanks, Kirsten. I know you're online. I know you found that for us and put that slide in. And then that is it. Let me see. I do have one comment, though. So I'm in lots of Facebook groups. And one of my colleagues' groups shared an amendment that they are proposing already. And just to let us know they're doing it in case, hey, if anybody else is trying this, we've got this done. So if you like what we've got, then you don't have to worry about it. If you don't, then here's some inspiration to do it yourself. So their concern that they had was that they were missing in the inspirations part the direct experience of transcending mystery and wonder, because that's just not in the draft right now. And that's something that came up for me also in my reading of it, because that's really important to me. And it's important to a lot of people. And so this group got together and they wordsmithed it and they had really generative conversations and they went round and round. And this is the language that they're proposing for the inspirations section. As Unitarian Universalists, we proclaim that direct experiences of transcending mystery and wonder are a primary source of inspiration. These experiences open our hearts, renew our spirits, and transform our lives. We use and are inspired by sacred and secular understandings that help us to make meaning of these experiences and to live into our values. We respect the histories, contexts, and cultures in which these understandings were created and are currently practiced. These sources ground us and sustain us in ordinary, difficult, and joyous times. Grateful for the experience that moves us, the religious ancestries we inherit, and the diversity which enriches our faith, we are called to ever deepen and expand our wisdom. So this is one of the proposed amendments that the UUA board will be considering in a stack of other proposed amendments that they're going to be sifting through. But just to give you an example of the kinds of conversations that are happening in these forums and groups and the feedback that is being reviewed. All right, I guess that's me. Thank you.
Okay, so it wouldn't be Unitarian or Unitarian Universalist not to have some dissenting voices. So that's what I'm going to present. Some of the groups, some fairly informal networks and other more legal identities, and let you know some of the voices that are being spoken aloud. But first I'll do a reading I just discovered this morning on a UU church service. It's from Michael Austin's book, We Must Not Be Enemies. You are wrong. You are profoundly and disturbingly wrong about a spectacularly large number of things. You accept facts that are not facts, values that are incompatible with each other, and a fair number of truly dumb ideas about how to change the world. If you ever really understood the extent of your wrongness, you would never trust another word you said. You need not feel shamed about this. I am wrong too. Everybody is wrong about a lot of things. Given the number of things that all of us believe or do not believe to be facts, the number of things that we consider or do not consider valuable, and the number of policies that we think or do not think will work, there is no possible way that anybody is going to be right about everything or even most things. You already accept this about 99.999% of the human population. You know perfectly well that everybody else is wrong about a lot of things. And if you really think about it, you will realize that you are probably not the only person in the world who is always right. So. Okay, Juliet, we've got the UUA Article 2 counterpoint up there. So it's a slide. Nope. It was called Forum UUA Counterpoint Short. Well, I'll start talking anyways, and a lot of this you can find elsewhere at some point if not here. And as Laura said, any of these presentations I sent, if you want a copy, just let me know. So sometimes called the resistance, the dissenters, or the gadflies, and as a Canadian, I'm loving the idea of it being the loyal opposition, because most people that are voicing are determined to stay in the religion, but hear their voice taken. So there's various groups, and some of them started with a particular focus. I think it's fair to say that at this point, all of the groups I mentioned would prefer to keep the current principles rather than have the Article 2 draft that's being circulated. So they're concerned about deleting the principles and sources. They're concerned about the changing purpose of no words reflecting Principle 6. Facts. So a group calling themselves the Fifth Principle Project was formed in 2018. They were primarily concerned about a change in how the UUA was interpreting democracy. So they're an organic grassroots initiative to gather people who want to reinvigorate the right of conscience and renew the democratic process. The key people are Jay Kiskell and Frank Casper, authors of a book they call Used to Be UU. We might not be getting these. I'll send them out. At Quimper UU Fellowship in Port Townsend in Washington State, they started what they called an affinity group, a fourth principle affinity group, concerned about that free and responsible search for truth and meaning. About 70 out of their less than 300 member congregation get together to do a monthly potluck. And now I notice that they've started doing a Zoom following the potluck. They initially proposed an adult education series, and the board did not agree to that, but this affinity group is listed on their website, et cetera, and anybody can join. And somebody from that started a broader email group where there's people from all over the States and a few Canadians. They have 120 people. And they do a weekly emotional support Zoom call. Anybody can just log in and say, I'm feeling unhappy about this, I want some support. It's open to all. They have a shared Google Drive with any documents that people want to share with each other. And currently it's mainly focused on Save the Seven Principles, but all sorts of conversations erupt. So locally, some of us, I'm in this group, formed a fourth principle group, somewhat modeled after Quimper. There's 29 people on the email list, 14 of us are UCV members. So we share information, things that we find. And I have to say, when I first realized that there was something happening, was in July, and I had COVID, and I got tired of Netflix, so I thought, well, I'm going to roam around the UU universe and see what's going on. And I found it very hard to kind of find what the issues really were as people. I mean, there's not agreement everywhere, but so what I'm sharing with you, I took a fair bit of time to find. And this group created a founding statement, and that was sent to UCV and the Beacon Unitarians boards, just to inform them that it's not associated with any congregation or institution, but wanted to know it existed. And I won't share the whole statement, it's on a website, but I wanted to assure you, I think, that the members here agreed that we're affirming and promoting a free and responsible search for truth and meaning, and we support individuals in their search and in speaking out, sustaining our liberal values and principles, still no slides, supporting congregations in fulfilling these commitments, and adhering to a covenant of healthy relations like that of Vancouver Unitarians. So not all of us are Vancouver Unitarians, but we put that in as kind of an example. So there's a very basic website, unitarianfourthprinciple.wordpress.com. If you want to see the founding statement, it's there. So then, to some degree, a major event in conflict was at the 2019 General Assembly in Spokane. The Minister of UU Spokane, Reverend Todd Eckloff, gave away this little book, the Gadfly Papers, with 3 essays in it. And here, I had to look it up. What's a gadfly? A fly that bites livestock, especially a horsefly, warblefly, or botfly. But in this context, obviously used as an annoying person, especially one who provokes others into action by criticism. And I'm sure Todd Eckloff likes to think that he's in the lineage of Socrates, who referred to himself as a gadfly. So Eckloff was removed from UUA fellowship for non-cooperation in 2020, and he then published a second book called The Gadfly Affair about his experience with that, published in 2021. And he has now, with others, formed an organization called the North American Unitarian Association, and he's president of the board. Several people from his congregation are on the provisional board. And they're open to individuals as well as congregations or groups, and they're encouraging people keep their UUA membership and join if they are in sympathy with the NAUA's goals. And they phrase it as open to Unitarians, they might say Unitarians and Universalists, and those of liberal faith who are interested. They've just launched the website this week, and they're committing to do a monthly community worship on a Saturday, having an online newsletter, annual meetings, small group ministry, and an educational program, as well as assisting in ministerial search, professional advice, and support for ministers. And then another group called the Unitarian Universalist Multiracial Unity Action Council has existed for about 4 or 5 years, but I'm told that it was a kind of a new incarnation of an ongoing group in Chicago. And they were primarily concerned about the approach that UUA is taking on anti-racism. So they have a different idea about how that should go. So then, so in June, this article draft comes for a vote. It needs 50% this year in order to go forward to the following year, and to actually be adopted in June of 2024, it would need a 2/3 positive vote. So who gets to vote at UU General Assembly? As in Canada, certified congregations get 1 member delegate for every member, 50 members. So a congregation of anywhere between 151 and 200 would get 4 delegates. I keep thinking you've got that up there, but you don't. So a question is, as was mentioned in Keith's package, there are 16 congregations that are still members of the UUA. During the early days of the 2000s, the UUA discovered there was no way for them to decide that a congregation was no longer a member. So the expectation had been that all congregations would quit the UUA since the organizations had split, but only 2/3 of the congregations did that. Of the 16, 10 have certified and therefore are eligible to vote at GA. 6 did not certify, and they need to certify if they're going to get delegate status. So, as in Canada, the UUA puts out a request for a certain amount of what we might otherwise call dues, but it's optional how much congregations contribute. So of the 16 that are still members, 4 paid $0 but certified, 2 paid $100, and of the remaining 4, they paid an average of $16,000. So they value their connection. So locally, North Shore, but not UCV, Beacon, or South Fraser are still UUA members. So a difference with UUA and CUC in terms of delegates is that UUA, as well as the member delegates, ministers automatically receive delegate status separate from however many their congregation gets, as do directors of, Director Emerita of Lifespan Learning, or ministers emerita, and also community ministers who are actively working in some field and are affiliated. So for instance, at North Shore, at CUC, they get 4 member delegates, but they actually could have 7 delegates at UUA. So will this Article 2 pass, albeit with dozens of amendments probably?
Oh, Lynn, thank you. And I did know that. I'm sorry. Lynn's sitting right here monitoring the chat for us. And we also have Karen Hall with a microphone to ferry around the room. And so if anybody has any questions for me or for Mary, happy to hear from you.
I'm sorry I have to leave early. I don't know if you can hear me. Is the mic on?
Yeah.
Okay. I just want to point out a discussion that Gerda Moray and I had on the way here this morning, and that concerns the Canadian 8th principle and the proposed equivalent here. And there's a question about whether this whole process is an attempt to avoid accountably dismantling racism and other systems of oppression, which is something that's included in our 8th principle. I think the wording in our 8th principle is very strong and very good. It took me a while to come around to the word accountably, but I did come around. And I don't see that that's as strong in what is proposed. Under love, it says accountable to one another, but it doesn't say accountably dismantle. Under justice, it says we covenant to dismantle racism and all forms of systemic oppression, but it doesn't say we accountably covenant or accountably dismantle. That's my comments.
Thank you. I do have something in here. So Carrie McDonald is the Executive Vice President of the Unitarian Universalist Association. And in one of the emails that went out in the weekly recently, there was a link to an article that he wrote recently for the UUA. Is this too loud? I can move it. Okay, I'll move it down away from my mic a little bit. There's something in here. I didn't highlight the pieces I needed to. I think the sense was that the intention for anti-oppressive, anti-racism work is throughout all of the values and all of the covenant statements in one way or another, but you're right, it's not a direct eighth principle statement. So I think some of it's dispersed throughout. But part of the charge that the commission made to, that the board made to the commission, asked it to do this work through that lens. So, but that's through the lens of anti-racism, anti-oppression, through the lens of the eighth principle intention to bring that into the commission's work. But you're right, it's not as explicit as it's listed as an eighth principle. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. I've read through this report or was reading this morning and heard you. And one thing that puzzles me, if for the UUA anyway, it implies a transition from principles-based religion, that we frequently promote these principles, and I agree with that and we do in Canada as well, when it came to Unitarian, to one that's based on values and covenants. In other words, to become Unitarian, I need to adopt all these covenants. So, which I didn't have to do before. I just have to adopt principles. So it's quite a dramatic shift, I think, in what Unitarian Universalism is about. And I wanted to like to comment on that.
Okay. It's a very different presentation of a statement of faith, if you will. I agree. I think that, and I'm just reading from the report, they say that individuals, and I mean the congregations can choose to adopt this themselves or not. The association is the one who'd be adopting it if they do. The congregations may establish statements of purpose, covenants, and bonds of union themselves, so long as they don't require that a member adhere to a particular creed. And to me, what's implicit in that is that this is not, the UUA is not requiring that any individual adhere to this as a creedal statement, but it's an aspiration to live into the value statements, and the covenant is a way to inform how you do that. But yeah, it's a different presentation. I've heard somebody suggesting that it's not taking away from the principles, it's just a new way of deepening into our commitment to the work, just different lens. I don't know if I answered your question, but yeah, it's very different.
We've got a request here for you to please restate that question. The sound is garbled and people couldn't hear it.
John, would you like to try to restate your question?
Sure, I'll try. How's this online? Is that loud enough?
That's clearer for here. Up here.
Okay, well, I asked to comment on what seems to be a major change in Unitarian Universalism in the States, from one that's based on affirming and promoting principles to one that's about being as a requirement of someone being adhering to that faith. Instead of being committed to affirming and promoting principles, we're asked to accept these values and make all those promises or covenants that are listed in the bylaws. So in order to get into the game in a way, you've got to make a whole set of promises you didn't have to do before.
Okay, thank you. That's actually clearer for me to respond to as well. And I think we spoke to this a little bit at the top of my presentation about why they're doing this, was that people needed more verbs, that the affirm and promote of principles wasn't enough walking of the talk. That's the rationale that people are coming forward with for that, to answer that question. I see Melody.
Yes, is this clear enough?
Yep.
You say that as individuals we wouldn't have to commit
to these values and covenants. But would the UUA demand that anybody who wants to be a minister would have to agree to those?
No. No, I mean, we don't sign a document that says we agree to these values or principles, but we are trained theologically in Unitarian Universalism. But and how we express that in different ways is up to the individual minister. But we are a covenantal faith, and we have guidelines about how we are in relationship with one another. But no, I wouldn't have to sign a document that says, yes, I agree to this, ever.
We were asked to read through this and consider how we felt. So, I will say that one of the things that I love about our eighth principle is it asks us to look at ourselves. And I don't see that in this. I don't see, there's humility is included in the interdependence part of it. But it does feel like, although it wants to talk about action, the actions in terms of anti-racism are pretty blurry and don't require us to look at how we personally manifest the systemic soup in which we live. And also it talks about beloved communities, which I don't see defined anywhere, and I think is different from welcoming communities, but I don't see it defined anywhere. Thanks.
Thank you. Beloved community is a phrase that is used quite commonly in the United States that is not so well known in Canada. It's used aspirationally. It comes out of, I think, the teachings of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., building beloved community. And so that's become a phrase that is common in anti-racism, anti-oppression work throughout the UUA, but it's not something we're so familiar with in Canada. If I'm looking at the 7 value statements here, and you're right, there's nothing direct, as you say, but if I read through each one of these, I can find a kernel of that self-reflective. But I think that's really good feedback, and this is why they're looking for amendments on how can these words be more meaningful, more impactful. I think that's a really good comment. I can pick out some things and say, well, maybe it's here, maybe it's there, but it's not. Yeah, I think that's a really good piece of feedback. I see John Smith, or okay, there's somebody at the YouTube.
We've got somebody online. And it's a question that I think has been answered, but it may need to be re-answered for others here as well. And it's just the question about, is the CUC required in any way to accept the changes if the UUA votes to accept them next year?
No.
No.
Can everyone hear me okay?
A little closer.
Okay. Yeah, it seems the proposals in Article 2 go beyond principles. To me, principles are the basic beliefs we have, like the inherent worth and dignity of every person. Many of us have our own ways of how we would act, and I think Unitarians in Canada have been very active in anti-racism, anti-ageism, and a lot of things. And in Article 2, they're sort of telling us how we're supposed to do this. And I see Unitarianism as a faith group. Some of us come here for many reasons. Our families, some of us get involved in environmental work where we're very strong. And also, there's a lot more words that I don't think cover anything that isn't in the principles. And we do have strategic priorities that we have annually, and I think they would probably be more of a place to put many of these ideas. And my final comment, love is at the center. One of the most loving people I ever knew was a Jehovah's Witness who lived across the street. She loved us all so much that she wanted to give us everlasting life. And I think love is one of the most misused words in the English language. Anywhere from sexual love to wanting to convince other people of our own ideas. So I have a major problem with love being at the center, and things like free and responsible search for truth and meaning is buried in a lot of words. And so I think it's much harder to understand. Someone wanting to become a Unitarian can look at the principles and get an idea of what we're about. Looking at those, they'd probably give up after reading halfway through. Anyway, my personal comments.
Just to echo what John said, he's much more eloquent than me, but I just wanted to say that love is such a cliched word, but I think John put it in much better terms.
Yeah, that's some of the feedback that I'm hearing around as well. We'll see what they do with that.
So I want to start off by stressing what Lynn said and just reminding all of us that these are UUA issues. They're not Vancouver Unitarian issues, and they're not CUC issues. So what they're discussing and what they're going through is their internal conversations and machinations, and they're not ours. I mean, yes, they are the big neighbor next door, and there will likely be some impact, but we are one big step removed from that, and I think it's important to keep that in mind in this conversation. Nonetheless, I do have one thing that I wonder about, because from what I've read about the concerns that some people have with this proposed Article 2 revisions, are that their concern is that it's recasting the UUA into a more authoritarian and top-down organization. And I just wonder about that, and I see it, I think, reflected in the statement. So the current statement of purposes says the primary purpose of the association, the UUA, is to serve the needs of its member congregations. That's its purpose, to serve the needs of its members. The proposal says that its primary purposes are to assist congregations in their vital ministries. So now it's getting more engaged in providing direction and to actively engage its members in the transformation of the world through liberating love. I'll just say that that makes me nervous. So I don't know all the details about why the people in the United States have these strong concerns. I think there's a longer history than I'm aware of, but I do see it highlighted in their statements of purpose, and so I just want to sort of bring that forward as something worth noting as what may be a significant change in the way UUA is moving to restructure itself in its relationship to its constituents. That's all.
Thanks. So thanks, Rob. That's great feedback. And thanks also for lifting up that this is not, it's not a CUC thing. It's not something that I'm really embedded in either. I'm not an expert here. I wish I had my colleague Kirsten here, who knows a lot more because of her involvement with liberal religious educators in the States and through other things. That's absolutely a valid comment, and I've heard that from others as well. Thanks.
Thanks, Rob, for pointing that out. And I think the thing that strikes me is that they're only going to welcome people who share their values. Now, on one hand, you think, well, that's good and obvious, but who gets to define whether somebody shares the values? And it's clear that several ministers have been defellowshipped because they weren't viewed as sharing the values. So, yeah, I guess that's the part that worries me.
Okay. And that's an interesting comment as well. I don't know how you can decide if somebody shares your values except if they live into it in covenantal relationship. And the ministers who have been removed from fellowship in the last couple of years chose not to be in covenantal relationship with their professional association when they were asked. The Ministerial Fellowship Committee takes these things really seriously, and I don't have all the details, and I know that nobody else here does too, but I don't think it's a fair statement to say they were removed from fellowship for not sharing values. I think there's probably a lot more to those stories than that. Thanks.
A couple of comments online, and one is from the CUC. There will be an opportunity for Canadian UUs later in May to have conversation, ask questions, etc. We will be hosting a roundtable on this topic.
Yay.
Yeah.
Somebody else can be in the hot seat.
There's also a comment from Keith here, just adding to the conversation that social justice is only one UU realm that calls for action. From existing principles, the words affirm, promote, accept, search, use of democratic process, respect are also calls for action. And a comment from Marcia, as Canadian Unitarians, however, we do draw upon UUA resource materials for congregational programs. We also call ministers under the guidelines of the UUA.
That's great. And I'd like to lift up the CUC has those incredible aspiration statements, but they speak, I think, in a lot of ways to perhaps what the intention of this work from the Commission is in many ways. The CUC's aspiration statements are, I think they speak to some of the missing links from the principles in a lot of ways, and that's unique to Canada.
Hi, this is the first time I've seen the direct comparison with the principles and the new values, which incorporate the principles and in some ways incorporate the sources, I guess. And so I think some of this is good in that, you know, the same wording is brought into the sources. Some things are kind of buried in them, and some things were omitted entirely, as you pointed out. The transcending mystery of wonder part, which to me differentiates Unitarianism or spirituality from other humanitarian and goodwill efforts that may be done and done through other sources and other groups, other functions. So, at any rate, I just would say that yeah, it does need a lot of rework in terms of the wording, in terms of the emphasis, where some things are sort of buried, which were emphasized in the principles, and so it's a work in progress, I guess. That's all I wanted to point out.
Thanks. Yeah, it's absolutely a work in progress, and I think in some ways we just need to trust the process. It's been ongoing for several years already, and it's going to continue to be going, and they're asking for people to participate in that process. And so that's what we're doing here, is to becoming more aware. What is the conversation? What are the words we're talking about? How do we get our feedback in? And just to raise awareness. It's not a done deal. Who knows where it's going to go? They might even just decide, nope, because, oh my goodness, there's been too much change already. I couldn't tell you how worse could this timing be? When this came out, I was like, are you kidding me? Not now. But nobody knew there was going to be a pandemic and everything else too. But it is a process. And I really want to lift up the hard work of the Commission. They were given a monumental task during the past couple of years that we've had to try to create processes to engage as many people as they did and incorporate all that feedback. It's remarkable. We know what it's like to try to get a survey out and get feedback. Elliot?
This is just sort of a sidebar and a curious question. In reading the materials that were sent out with the bulletin, I think in one of the things that Kirsten wrote, she said something about one of the criticisms of the principles that's been ongoing for decades apparently is that they were not poetic enough. And the board, the UUA board, charged the Article 2 Commission Task Force people, whatever, to make them more poetic or something. I mean, I find that a curious criticism. And I'm not sure if this diagram and the words on the back are more or less poetic than the principles that we have, but it just seems like a... Anyways, again, it's a sidebar. It just sort of struck me from left field. Do you have any comment on the lack of poetry involved?
Well, when I read through the principles, and they're just so familiar to me because I grew up with them, but if I look at them line by line, it's some pretty old-fashioned language, and it's a bit clunky, that's true. For people coming in and engaging with those words now, 30, 40 years after they were written, it is not common language. And, but I also know just some of the conversation with people in the commissions, they were saying, does anybody have a poet on call? Because they were having a hard time trying to figure that out. And the graphic, too, they were looking for something that can easily be taken on by our religious education departments. And I know a number of congregations have just taken one value per Sunday for a while. And I had an idea that I shared with folks of making a pinwheel or like a roulette wheel on a stand in coffee hall for it, and you just like spin it to see where it stops, and then have a conversation about that one. There's so many things you can do. I saw somebody actually came up with they asked the religious educator to find some kind of handout for Sunday service to talk about these Article 2. And they came back from the dollar store with these windmills that have different colored petals, and it's just so perfect. And there was exactly the right number of petals, and they wrote, so it's kind of more approachable that way, I think, for people. It would be hard to do something like that with one word on the principal statements. So I think in some ways people are going to find this an easier resource for promotion. But who knows? We'll see where it goes. I see John. Oh, and okay.
Yeah.
Lynn.
So I've got a personal comment, which is that I'm actually seeing this right now as having really positive potential. Since the CUC is not planning to immediately adopt anything the UUA does, it's an opportunity for more of a conversation about our Canadian Unitarian identity. And I'm actually really looking forward to that. And I don't know if you noticed, when Mary had up the slides from 2008, over and over you would see U*U in the text. And that meant Unitarians and Unitarian Universalists and Universalist Unitarians and Universalists. And I thought it was beautiful. I really loved it. And what we've seen over the last decade or so is a real shift towards just using Unitarian Universalist more and more often to define us, to say that our faith is Unitarian Universalist. And I really identify as a Unitarian, so I have a bit of trouble with that. But I love the U*U, and I really hope maybe that we can even like reignite that within Canada as we go perhaps a bit of a separate way from the American UUA. And there's one comment here from Kirsten on behalf, in her role as a board member of the CUC, saying that the CUC is currently looking at our decision-making processes, our bylaws, and how we go about defining Unitarian/Unitarian Universalism in Canada. And these will be ongoing conversations for us.
And so this article from Kerry MacDonald, there's one piece in here that I really appreciated him saying. He says, if nothing else comes of this, he feels that our denomination has not been able to engage well in self-reflective spiritual theological conversations in recent years. And exactly things like this, the who are we conversations. And so he says, if nothing else, this process will have had us engaging in deeper theological conversations about what matters the most. And that's value add right there.
This might have been already printed somewhere or mentioned somewhere, and I apologize if I missed it. Since we're not, according to Mary, we're not members of the UUA, but the North Shore Unitarian is, for example, any kind of feedback from us is it getting implemented some way? Like, is it the CUC itself a member, or do we pass it on to North Shore Unitarian, or how, is there any way we are affecting this from discussions or just for our own information?
I haven't looked at the feedback forms myself to know if you actually need to identify as a UUA member congregation delegate to be able to give feedback. There is a process, there's a form. So if you have feedback that you want to share, go check it out. If you're not able to do it because you're not eligible to be a delegate, then talk to somebody at the North Shore Beacon and they can get access. Yeah. 3 hands just went up. Okay, we have 2 minutes.
There's something that's bothering me, and I'm not sure that I can exactly put it into words, but it goes something like this. I don't want to see us integrate this into our practices and our ways of being so much before the CUC has an opportunity to grapple with it and set out a process. So I don't know if that makes sense, but personally, I don't want to use this framework until we have an opportunity in Canada to decide how we're going to deal with it. So if it just becomes part of our practice, then why have a process? So, yeah, that concerns me.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Yeah, I think what's being asked of us is just to be aware. We don't want to be blindsided when it comes to June 2024 without having been engaged in the conversation and being aware of what's going on. Can't hear you.
Can you hear me now? Okay. I'm left with one question, and that's why. There's nowhere in this report where there's any rationale for ditching the principles and going this values and covenant route. Nowhere. And it's puzzling to me. And you've said people want more verbs. Okay, well, I mean, that's good, but that's pretty, doesn't argue for me. I mean, it doesn't do the job. So I just don't know why they felt the need to ditch the principles.
I think I did cover that earlier in a couple of different places, the whys. And I think that's there can be a lot more conversation about that. But I do have some point form here under why there was some, all the way back when they formed them in the first place, there was concern that even setting the principles anywhere would create what was called a creeping creedalism in the way people are going to use them. And that's what we've seen. Because we don't have any other simple way of saying who we are, then we've identified these principles, the 6 principles and then the 7 principles and now the 8th principles as, well, this is who we are. And that's actually a creedal statement. And there was some concern about that all the way back to Theodore Parker. So that was one reason that people have been saying, well, we can't keep this written in stone. It was never meant to be put in stone. It's up for review. So that was one reason to look at it. There's also a perception that it's incomplete, that any kind of list that you create just begs the next bullet point in a list, and that's actually been proven as we keep, as the principles keep getting revised and added to. It's an incomplete list. So what is then the permanent? If we're just going to keep adding to it or tweaking it, what is actually the through line? What are the basic elements here that we're working with? And so I think they wanted to just take a fresh look at it. So that's another reason. Some others also said they were dissatisfied with what they saw as an excessive emphasis on the individual, and so that the creative nature of community and interdependence were less important in the way that the principles are listed and explained. The idea of individuality came out of the humanist movement in the middle of the last century, and the words are just really clearly individually focused, and people feel that that's been to the detriment of our organization. And so that was another thing that they just wanted to address it. And instead of going through the principles and trying to make individual amendments. As you saw, they've tried over and over. Some work, some don't, and it's back and forth, and it's all this wordsmithing. At the end, they just said, well, let's do a full review on this because it's been 38 years and we're supposed to do it every 15. So there's another why there, is that it's actually mandated in the bylaws to have this look. And that there's probably more, but we're over time now. But thanks for the question. I think it's valid. I was wondering that too, like, why? and they have reasons. There are reasons. Last question, please. I need a break.
Yeah, one of my concerns, can anyone hear me? Mm-hmm. Is the process. And I think the process of the 8th principle, and also what seems to be evolving in the UUA, is a lack of respect. I think that during the process of the 8th principle, there were more emails in the UCV or the CUC leaders group that were insulting rather than productive and not listening with respect to the other point of view. And I see that involving in the UUA from both sides. And I find it disappointing that we have free and responsible search for truth and meaning and the inherent worth and dignity of every person. And if I insult someone, I'm not giving them dignity. And that's my biggest problem with this whole process, the way it's progressing. And as Unitarians, we don't seem to have the capacity to respectfully relate to someone who has a different point of view. And so that's my biggest concern about this whole thing.
Thanks, John. Yeah, I mean, it's so painful. It's a symptom of our larger society right now as well. And I think that the process around the 8th principle in Canada and how that went, it's sad. It's tragic. It was painful. It still is. And I think we can learn from those processes. And this is actually, it's one of the other reasons that the commission decided, or that the delegates wanted this review to happen, is because these conversations and debates on the floor around things like the 8th principle were not getting us to the point, weren't getting us back into community and into great dialogue. It became, the pro and the con mics were not generative anymore, they were divisive. And so this is another way to look at how can we be in respectful dialogue and conversation and really find out where we are in covenantal community with one another and to try to open those doors to listen and set up platforms. And I think the commission has actually done a pretty remarkable job of doing forums, and everyone, even if you're not a member, you can engage, and it's still this ongoing process, and they're looking for feedback, and they were tasked to be open, and this, I don't know what else they could do to generate more openness, but no, we'll see. Anyways, I want to thank you all for your participation, for your very thoughtful questions, for your listening, and I'm sure this is just the first of many, many conversations. And I am not an expert on this, and if I've misspoken in any way, I apologize in advance. I'm just going with the materials that I've been given as well, and it's a process. And I'm just trusting in the process, and I trust in our good people. So thank you so much. Just really pitching in today. Amazing work.